right ahead.
Pardon me?
Go right ahead.
Okay. My father's name was Luther R. Jeffries, and he was born September the 13th, 1908, in a house on a corner of Church and Chestnut Streets in Port Norris. I don't know too much about his childhood, but I do know that he had a very loving, kind mother and a very strict, hard-working father. They were both very honest people. My dad inherited, thank the Lord, his mother's disposition and not his father's. As a child, he suffered from pleurisy pneumonia, and he nearly died, which this led to removal of one of his ribs to drain his lung. I suspect it might have caused trauma to his heart, causing a great disappointment when he became an adult. Growing up, his time was spent playing baseball. That was the great American sport, and it was his greatest love. Not before my mother or before the children, but the very next thing. Not having a wealthy family, my dad would have to make his own baseballs out of string. He played baseball throughout his time in school and on the Oyster League. He was a left-handed pitcher and quite accomplished in his sport. He was also a romantic who loved to read and memorize poetry. And throughout my brothers and my growing up period, my dad would recite all kinds of beautiful poetry to us. During his senior year at Port Norris High School, he was approached by a scout from Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. He was awarded a fully paid 4-year baseball scholarship to Bucknell University. During his sophomore year, he injured his heart while playing this beloved sport. He came home to Port Norris no longer able to play, and the United States at that time was suffering from the Great Depression. Fortunately, there was an abundance of oysters, and my dad went to work on my grandfather's oyster boat, the R&A Jeffries. He worked in the middle of the deck, and he was also chief, cook, and bottle washer. And it was a good thing because he used that later in life. In the meantime, he was courting Marion Lloyd, and they were married in 1931. Sometime after my brother was born in 1933, my dad became employed by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in Millville. And although he did not possess an aggressive personality, he won awards for superior salesmanship. One year, he sold $500,000 worth of insurance, and that was a great deal during the recovery from the Depression. He would quietly, and this was typical of him, he would quietly pay premiums for those who did not have a dollar or two to pay for their insurance premiums. While others in our neighborhood had ice boxes, we had a refrigerator and a really nice Chevy sedan. We took even vacations to Fortescue. That was wonderful. But due to the Depression, more and more insurance he had to sell. Every year he had to sell more. My father fell under his own depression. He and my mother, who was his emotional support, bought not the store, but the business of Mr. Massey, who had a small sweet shop on the corner of Main and Market Streets. This was 1944, and the country was in the midst of the Second World War. The young men in town were engaged in freeing our world from the evils of dictatorships. My father, due to his heart condition, was classified 4F, therefore not able to serve his country, but he and my mother were serving many sailors, soldiers, Air Force men, and during lunchtime, they were serving the teenagers who were attending Port Norris High School. They worked from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. taking care of business. They would take turns going home during the day to rest. I remember hearing my mother crying from exhaustion. It was very hard work. And then the war was over. What a celebration there was in Port Norris. I remember my father made effigies of Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. The town gathered at the Ball Diamond located across the street. I believe it's called the Shiloh Baptist Church. And it's on Memorial Avenue, and they had a huge bonfire, and they cremated those scoundrels that night. Everybody was there from the town. It was a wonderful celebration, and although I was very young, I remember that great big fire. During the following years, and I always have to mention my mother because they were a team. They worked together with everything and through everything. During those following years, my dad and mother purchased the building and the business from Lou Mathis, located across the street from their sweet shop. And they proceeded eventually to build an addition which became a restaurant. And for a few years, they served home-cooked meals. You remember that? And my father cooked. He did not attempt to bake. He could not bake a puffy cake. They were always this thick. And my mother did the baking. They also served the local Rotary Club during their meetings that were held in their restaurant. They employed young teens in the kitchen during lunch hour and older teens in the evening. For 10 years, they were a permanent fixture on Main Street. They installed a real old-fashioned soda fountain and a huge machine in the kitchen which was called a carbonator. And this thing, every time they made a soda and pulled the handle, this thing came on in the kitchen. And it sent carbonated water to the fountain, and then they would add it to the syrup. This thing, it was so mysterious and loud. And it had a belt that went around when it started. And if you would be in the kitchen and happened to fall into that thing, they would call Nell Lanning. If you know who he was. He was the town mortuary. They had a Wurlitzer jukebox that seemed to be in constant use with the flashing lights and the good music. That was good music after the war. During that time, alcoholic beverages could not be purchased locally, but a person might be fortunate enough to locate a speakeasy in the surrounding area. Not that my mother and father had one at their store, but everybody knew where they were. Even I did, as little as I was. During the summer months, my father would put a Coca-Cola cooler on the sidewalk in front of the store filled with ice and bottles of soda. As the years went by, the restaurant began to hurt their health, so they sold it to Grace Barrett, who eventually sold it to Jane Addams, and eventually it led to the business called Jelly Beans. My father still loved baseball, and during those years he erected a small square building at the same diamond where he played during his teen years. And during every game you could find him there selling hot dogs, sodas, and snacks. He was adding to the family income while enjoying his real love, baseball. Those were the Port Norris days. Then they purchased a considerably large portion of land near Green Creek, New Jersey. And my mother worked for Abbas Dairies in Wildwood, and my father managed a clam house owned by his brother Norman, which was located on the bay near Pierce's Point. He and my mother's brother, John Lloyd, partnered in building a mobile home park on that aforementioned property. It had a clubhouse and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It was a very successful venture. Then my father signed a contract with a Delaware oysterman to provide and plant wire bags of clamshells in the bay to catch the oyster spat. Unfortunately, that was the year that MSX hit the bay. Unfortunately, for the Delaware oystermen, the oysters died, but fortunately for my dad, the contract was legal. So he benefited from the contract, even though the oysters died. Then they sold the mobile home park. and purchased a house in Green Creek, adding an addition to house my mother's love, which was antiques. Then back to Port Norris they came. They had their final move to Port Elizabeth, while my father became partners with my brother and a nuclear physicist, Charlie Thompson, in a business in Port Norris. But all those years of hard work allowed my mother to have her beloved antique shop, known as the Iron Kettle Antique Shop, and my father to enjoy his love, baseball and basketball and football. During those years at Christmas, my mother would bake her what we called lassie cakes, and my father would be out purchasing gifts for little children who would not have had a Christmas gift if it were not for he and my mother's hard work. Although they did not come from wealthy families, they enjoyed the wealth that was ingrained in them from growing up in Port Norris. That makes me emotional. One thing for sure, it's not what the legends have done for Port Norris, it's what Port Norris has done for the legends.